As Lisa said, I've worked with Mission to the World for 25 years and kind of did a whole lot of different types of mercy ministry. And then I've been with Sacred Roots Farm now we've been open almost 2 years, so I've been the program director there for about 2 years now. It's been a rich, rich blessing for me to be able to sit still and minister instead of traveling all over. But I kind of want to talk to you just a little bit about how God brought me to where I am today. Because it didn't come easy. I didn't come willingly. I fought a good bit of the way. I grew up in Winder, and I grew up in an alcoholic home. So we had a lot of turmoil in our life, and we didn't go to church regularly. But I can still hear my mom singing hymns. When life was hard for her, she would always break out into a hymn. So I know that in her heart she loved Jesus. And so that's my memory of Christ. I didn't think I needed a God in my life. I figured I managed my life pretty well and could handle life without any other outside sources. I grew up in the 60s. I was a teenager and a young woman in the 60s, and I loved the lifestyle. If it feels good, you do it. Make love, not war. I loved all of that, and I loved the freedom that I thought I had in the 60s. I met Ben, my sweet husband, when I was in college. I started to college, and I was going to major in sociology and was going to join the Peace Corps, and I wanted to work in the deepest, darkest Africa and in a very primitive setting. That was what I wanted to do. God had other plans. As I was walking down the main street of Winder one day, on my way to visit a friend, this car passed, and I knew the guy that was driving, so I waved. And so when I got to where my friend was, this car was there too, and he was also going to see her friend, my friend. And in the car was this other guy, and at that time, his name was Benji. And so he introduced himself, and we talked for a little bit. He said, well, can we go out tonight? And I said, well, sure, I don't have anything else to do. You know, I never planned, I was always for the moment. And so I said, sure. So 6 weeks later, we got married. And he was in the Marine Corps, so we only saw each other 3 times. And the 3rd time we saw each other was when we got married. So we did a lot of talking on the phone. And a month after we married, he left to go to Vietnam to go overseas. So all of my friends that I hung with had bets that I probably wouldn't last 3 months with this marriage. And but I proved them wrong. So, because strangely enough, we loved it. It was amazing how deep our love was for each other that fast. And again, I want you to see the sovereignty of God in our lives. I'm used to not believing God. I didn't think there was one, and nobody planned my life for me. I did everything on my own. But as I walk through mine and Ben's life, I want you to see the sovereignty and why he chose us to be together. So he got back from overseas, and that's when I really got to know him really well. And we found out that we were very much alike. We had the same personality. We loved people. We both loved to talk. We both loved to party. So we had a lot in common. So we enjoyed our life together. We'd been married 4 years, and we had a daughter. And we called her name was Hope. And even then, I see God's plan, even in the naming of our child. And of course, she became the apple of Ben's eye. And he did everything with her, loved her, took her on walks. He had tea parties with her. I wouldn't have tea parties. But when she was 4, and she came home one day, and she went to a nursery. We called them nurseries then, a child care in Winder, happy hour. And this family also went to the same church that Lisa and Stephanie's family went to. But while she was there, she prayed to receive Christ. And so she and Daddy Jaybird began to pray for Ben and me, because we were, at that time, we were just pure heathens. And so they began to pray for us. And in January of 1970, Hope asked her dad why we didn't go to church like everybody else did. And of course, whatever she said was the gospel to Ben, so he decided we'd go to church. And I decided we wouldn't. And so eventually he convinced me to go. And so we went to church, but I have to tell you why we went to the church we went to. Ben worked for Goodyear, and there was a man that came to get his tires checked, and if he had car problems, they always brought him to Ben, and his name was Tom McGinnis. And Ben said, if I'm going to go to church, I'm going to go to the church that Tom McGinnis goes to, because that's the nicest man I've ever met in my life. And so that's why we started at the church we started at. And so I went, they went regularly, I didn't go, I would go on and off. And, but in August of 1979, I was, Ben and I rode horses together. So I was sitting one evening waiting, all dressed in riding clothes, waiting for Ben to come home so we'd go horseback riding. And there was a knock on the door, and it was one of my neighbors said, I need to take you to the hospital. Ben has been in an accident. And I got really upset because I had plans and he had messed them up. So she said, and I said, well, okay, I'll run. And she said, no, I think I probably need to take you. She said, it's a really bad accident. And so anyway, she drove me to the hospital. When I worked actually for doctors at that time. And the doctor that had been on call was one of the doctors I worked with. And he met me as I came to the door and he said, Opal, this is not good. And then he explained to me what had happened. And Ben he worked for Goodyear, and he had been changing a big forklift tire. And when he started to put the air in the tire, it exploded. And the rim blew off and hit Ben between the eyes and took off the whole right side of his head and the right lobe of his brain. And he said, I'm not quite sure Ben's going to make it. And so I'm sending him to Athens to a neurologist, a neurosurgeon there. And so he took me to Athens. Ben went in the ambulance, and then I met the doctor, and his prognosis was, doesn't look good. I'm not sure he's going to make it through surgery. If he does, he will more than likely be a vegetable. And he said, it looks like, from what I can tell, his brain looks like somebody went in with a crochet hook and just went around and around. He said, it is scrambled. And he said, so if he survives, it's, and even then, he started with, you probably need to start thinking about nursing homes if he survives. So even at the very beginning, he was giving me the worst news. And I can remember sitting there, and my sisters came, a pastor came, Warren came, and I wasn't a believer. But I just never doubted that Ben was not going to live. I knew he was going to make it. And so they let me go in to see him. Of course, he was convulsing and didn't know I was there. And so they took him into surgery, and I think he was in surgery about 13 hours. And so when he came out, the doctor came and told me that, he said, well, he survived. And he said, again, he's not going to be able to hear. He's not going to be able to see. He probably won't be able to walk. So you need, he was saying you need to start planning for your future. And of course, I didn't hear any of that. The next day, he was in intensive care, and in walks these three little ladies to come and visit with me. One of them was Dot McGinnis, the other one was Betty Graves, and the other one was Carolyn Nelson. And they sat with me for a long time and didn't say a whole lot, they just sat. And they told me, they said, we sat there and all you did was just rock. You rocked back and forth. You never talked, you just rocked. And so they stayed with me for a good while, and then they left. And they came back a couple of days later, all three of them again. And I remember, I think it was Miss Carolyn Nelson told me, she said, I want you to read Isaiah 55 to Ben. She said, I know he's in a coma. She said, but you don't know what the Spirit might hear. And she said, so I want you to start reading that to him. And I looked at her, and I know I must have been the devil himself. And I said, I do not own a Bible. And she said, well, I will make sure you get one. And the next day, I had a Bible in my hands. And so I thought, well, if nothing else, I'm going to read Isaiah. So I began to read Isaiah 55 to Ben. He was in a coma, totally out of it. But as I began to read, I started to weep, because I think God, first of all, had to break me, because I was probably one of the hardest people. I can remember the first day I went to church, I smoked. And the pastor was standing there, and I can remember walking up to the front door, looking him in the face and taking a big puff of cigarette and blowing that out and stomping the cigarette right out in front of the door. That was my hardness of heart. But I began to read this, and my heart just began to melt. And Isaiah, I'm going to work, my testimony works through Isaiah 55. So, but the first passage is, "Come, everyone who thirsts, come to the waters, and he who has no money, come buy and eat. Come buy wine and milk without money and without price. Why do you spend your money for that which is not bread, and your labor for that which does not satisfy? Listen diligently to me, and eat what is good, and delight yourselves in rich food. Incline your ear to me, and come to me. Hear that your soul may live." And I read that. I read those verses every day, and they began to penetrate in my heart. And I began to realize that everything that I had always wanted, I was searching for happiness in all the wrong places. And that what God was calling me through this accident was calling me to himself, to find out what real food was, and what real peace was, and what real joy was. So I prayed to receive Christ. And of course, the prognosis for Ben always was, he's going to be a vegetable. You need to, start planning for a nursing home. And my response was, well, we're supposed to go to Disney World in September. Do you think that I should cancel the trip, or do you think we're going to make it? Now, Ben was still in a coma. This was my thinking, And the doctor said, "Miss Hardgrove, I think you better postpone your trip." So I did, reluctly, because I thought we would go. So Ben was in a coma for, I think it was 3 months. And then they moved him out of ICU into just a normal room. And I was sitting with him one day. Of course, they kept him strapped down because he was so agitated and, kind of moved around a lot. And so I noticed he kept looking at his cuff, and he would turn it, and there was writing on the cuff. And so I was watching him, and I would flip the cuff so the writing would be on the other side. And he would take it and he'd turn it back around, and I could tell he was trying to see what it was. And so I got up and walked around the room, and he followed me as I walked. So I called a nurse, and I said, "I think he can see." And she was like, No, he can't. This is just, it's your desire, but there's no way, because when the rim had been put in the eyes, it severed his optical nerve, right where it branches to the right and the left. So it had been cut right there. And she said, he can't see. And I kept saying, "No, he can." And so I kept doing she left. So she kept doing other things, and I kept doing other things with him, and I'd put a Coke can, and I'd say, "What is this?" And he'd say, "It's a Coke," which was already something they said he'd never do. They said he'd never talk, or he would never hear me again. But he heard I asked the question, he answered. And so then I went and got her again. I said, "You call the doctor, because I know he can see." And so finally the doctor came, and he did all these little tests, and I have to tell you this, because this is my sweet little husband. And so he did all these tests, and you could tell Ben was getting more and more agitated with him. So finally he held up 4 fingers. He said, "All right, Ben, how many fingers do I have up?" Ben looked at him, and he said, "4, you SOB." And so the doctor turned around, and he said, "I think he can see." I said, "I think so too." And so then from there on, he changed he said, "I think he might work well in rehab. I think we might go ahead and see about doing rehab instead of a nursing home." That was an answer to prayer, because I had been praying that passage in Matthew where asking you shall seek, seeking you shall find, knocking the door shall be open. Every day I prayed that over Ben's vision. To God, I ask you that you would open his eyes. I seek you because you're a healer. I knock on your door because you have the power to heal him. And so then they called in a neuro-ophthalmologist, and he said, this is the strangest thing. He said, there's one thread of his nerve to his left eye and that is what is enabling him to see. He lost his right eye, he said, but the left eye, he's got enough of that nerve left that he's going to be able to see. And so they sent him to Emory, and they started doing rehab on him. And he responded well. I can't go through all the stuff that we went through, but it was a trying time for us. And so then when they finally said, well, we've done all we can do for him here, we'll send him home, I was so excited because I was bringing my husband home. You know, we're going to be normal, and maybe we could go to Disney World in December. It was my thinking. And so when we got home, I will tell you, it took me 3 days to realize that the man that left my house on August 10th, Friday morning, to go to work was not the man I brought back home 6 months later. He was a totally different human being. He was violent. He was an emotional roller coaster. He was up and down with, you know, 1 minute he'd be crying, the next minute he'd be laughing, the next minute he was coming at me with a knife. I mean, it was just like this crazy life. And I would call the doctor, and he would say, I've never had anybody like to survive Ben's injury. I don't know what to do with him. I can put him together, but I don't know what to do now. So I called a psychologist, and he said, well, lock him in the basement. And I was like, okay. At this point, I weighed like 100 pounds, and Ben weighed like about almost 200. And he was telling me to lock him in the basement so I would be safe. And I was like, well, I don't think that's going to work. So long story short, it wound up, because he was so violent toward me and so violent toward our daughter, that they wound up and put him in a mental institute because he was so violent. Well, during this time in Georgia, you have to have a rehab specialist if you have a catastrophic injury, which was what Ben was classified as. And so she came on the picture. She was a believer. She was a Christian. And so she started doing some research and found a place in Illinois that would take behavioral issues. And so they came, they interviewed Ben in the home, and she looked at me and she said, we've never had anybody like him before. I'll have to discuss this with my staff. We may not be able to handle him. And so she went back and talked to her staff, and they were willing to give him a 6 weeks trial. And we had to sedate Ben to get him there. He was so agitated and violent. And so when he got there, they took him off all of his meds. I had to leave him. I couldn't see him again for a month, which was horrible because I didn't know what they were going to do to him. And but he responded within 3 weeks. He was responding to them and was starting to be able to manage his behavior, his anger, and he talked incessantly, just never stopped. And so they started working on all of those things, and he was there for only 6 months, and they brought him back home. During the time he was gone, I have to go back to the church body because Dot McGinnis hosted a Bible study in her home, and I went to that. Lisa was there at the time, and she discipled me and grew me in the Lord with such patience, and because I was a new believer, and she was very patient doing that Bible study and spent time with me, helping me as a wife try to figure out this new man I was married to. It was so different. Ben was so different that one of the doctors I worked for told me, he said, Opal, you're the only woman I know that's only been married one time, but you have 2 husbands. And that was essentially the difference in my life. But Dot and Betty Graves both walked alongside me and dealt with my outbursts and my fears and my learning to love this new person in my life. And they walked with me through all of that. That's how I want you to see the body working, to take this poor broken little woman, and they loved me through some hard times, and they loved Ben too. And when Ben came home, then Tom, Lisa's dad, made sure that Ben got out. He would take Ben out often. Not very many men would deal with Ben because he was just very different. And But Tom would come and spend time with him, and Dave Krieger, he was an elder in our church, and he spent a tremendous, I can remember Dave Krieger picking Ben up, and he would go to their house, and they would walk to Wendy's, which was probably from y'all's house 3-4 miles one way, and he would walk Ben to Wendy's to get something to eat, and they'd walk back home, which burned up a lot of energy in Ben because he had a lot. So, but those two men ministered to Ben in such a special way. They helped him. They did Bible studies with Ben. They helped him with scripture memory, and they invested in Ben. And those women invested in me and in my daughter. They came alongside her and ministered to her. In the process of all of that, our church had a missions conference, and we went to the missions conference, and then and there I decided I was supposed to be a missionary, and I was supposed to go live overseas. I was joining the Peace Corps, so I figured this is what God wanted me to do now, was just go live overseas. And so there was a couple that came one time to our church, and he was a Peruvian. He was a Quechua Indian, and she was American. She had married him, and so when they would come to town, they'd always stay with us. And he, again, invested in Ben. And I can still see them walking down the road together, and him holding Ben's hand and talking to him about God and Peru. And he would always tell Ben, I want you to come to Peru, because I want my people to see what God can do. Because, Ben was supposed to die, and he didn't. Then, in Isaiah, where it says, Isaiah 10, where it says, for as the rain and the snow come down from heaven, and do not return there, but water the earth, making it bring forth and sprout, giving seed to the sower and bread to the hearer, so shall my word be that goes out from my mouth. It shall not return to me empty, but it shall accomplish that which I purpose, and shall succeed in the thing for which I sent it. And Ben prayed to receive the Lord. And I think it was having been faithful in reading those words to him, the investment of Tom McGinnis, David Krieger, invested in Ben's life, and he became a believer, a stronger believer than me, actually. And he grew. I always love to say his vision was really bad when he first came home, but the more he grew in the Lord, the better his vision got. It was almost like Paul, when God removed the scales from Paul's eyes again and he could see. That I always likened Ben to that. God, when he prayed to receive Christ, God began to remove the scale from Ben's eye and he could see. So he became a believer, all because of the investment of so many around him. But I didn't give up on being a missionary, and I kept begging God, look, I know I'm supposed to be a missionary. I'm gifted. I love to talk. I love you. I can share the gospel really well, so send me to the mission field. And I wanted to go to Peru. That's where I wanted to go. And so it was like, no, you can't go. And I really fought God on that one. And so I did go to church on a short-term mission trip with my church once, and we went to the Cherokee Reservation. And while I was there, I was just reinforced that I was supposed to go to the mission field. And I loved talking to the people, learning their culture, and just delving into their lives. But God always said no. Until one day, Mission of the World called and wanted to know if I would be willing to raise support and come work for them. And so I said, yeah. So I started raising support in August and went to work for them in October. And I started the day Hurricane Opal hit Alabama. And so my first day, they had pasted a news clipping on Hurricane Opal, the devastation of Hurricane Opal. And it was all the mess. And so they said, is this what we have to look forward to with you in our midst? So they soon learned it was. So, I started working on Native American reservations. I would take Ben with me on occasion, and they loved Ben. I mean, they would blow by me and they loved Ben because he was just Ben. And I think they could see his suffering and they could relate to him in his suffering. And so then one day I kept bugging them to let me go to Peru, and they kept saying, we'll never let you out of the country. You can't go out of the country. And so I went in to work one day, and on my desk was this little note, and Steve Collins, I don't know if y'all know him, he was a part of my life too, had left a little note on my desk about a ministry to street children in Peru. And he said, we thought you should go over and scout this out. So I got to go over to Peru. And that's when I started working with street kids there. Romulo, that had invested so much in Ben, had been martyred. This was during the time of the Shining Path in Peru, and he had been martyred. And so I didn't get to go while he was there. But I did get to go and visit his family and visit his grave. And so that meant the world to me, that God gave me that opportunity to see him. So I worked in Peru with street kids for about 8 to 9 years. Loved every minute of it. Knew I was supposed to live there. Kept telling God, I need to move here. And so the boys that I work with, we work with street boys, and they kept telling me, won't you bring Ben to see us? And I was like, no, y'all are terrible. Y'all will make fun of him, and I don't want anybody to hurt his feelings, because he's pretty scarred, and it's obvious. And so anyway, I finally broke down and took him one time, and so they rushed right by, just blew by me, forgot I was even there, and we're all over Papa Ben, and that's what they started calling him, Papa Ben, and they love Papa Ben. And, they took him around and showed him Peru, and so he started coming over. I would mentor college students in the summertime there, and so my boss at that time would bring Ben over, and he would spend the summer. Our anniversary is July 3rd, so he would come on our anniversary, and so the boys would take care of Ben while I worked with the college students. And I told him, I said, I don't want to know what you do, just keep him safe. And so I don't know what all they did, but they couldn't speak English, he couldn't speak Spanish, but it was fascinating to see the bond between them. And so one night I had one of the boys was giving his testimony to a group of college students, and Ben had gone to bed, and he looked at me, and he looked at them, and he said, Papa Ben belongs to us. He's one of us. Because when you look at him, you know he's had a hard life. And when he goes out, people make fun of him just like they make fun of us. And they stare at him just like they stare at us. So he belongs to us. And then he looked over at me and he said, and Mama Opal could have left Papa Ben, a long time ago, and she didn't. So we know that she won't ever leave us either, because she stayed faithful to Papa Ben. And from that time on, Ben broke the ice with those boys. And they started opening up and sharing, and several of those boys prayed to receive Christ. About 4 of them still call Ben on Father's Day. And they're all like in their 30s now, and they have children of their own, but they call Ben on Father's Day, and they call him on his birthday, and they've checked on us weekly since the virus has been here to make sure we're okay. And so that's the bond, but it came from Ben. And I always think of that passage where, it's in Corinthians where it says God chooses the weak and I can't remember the other word, to confound the wise. And I've seen that in Ben's life over and over, how he has been able to reach into a soul and reach somebody's heart that I would never be able to because of his situation. Once I worked in Peru, got a lot of work, and missionaries established there. And then the MTW sent me to Kenya. And there I met Mary Ash. And she was my roommate on a trip. And our favorite thing to talk about Mary Ash is she blew up my blow dryer. So
Mary Nash.
Nash, I'm sorry, I know
That's
it's Nash.
okay.
Yeah.
I did blow up
But her claim to fame is she blew up my hairdryer. So, but we remained friends, didn't we?
Yes, we did. We had some good conversations.
We had a great time. And I worked in Kenya on and off for about 10 years with HIV positive women and orphans, and then worked also with the pastor there to establish homes for girls that had been sold into early marriage. They were rescued from early marriage. So what is trafficking like? And so from there, I've traveled a lot. I can probably tell you where I haven't been more than I can tell you where I have been. And I always sit and think how gracious God is to let this little girl that never moved out of Winder see the world. And I've seen the world, and it's been amazing to me. But Ben has a heart for missions, and I had a heart for missions, and I still felt like I should live on the mission field. God still said no. So from then, MTW asked me if I would go to Greece and to work with some pastors there to see if there was any way we could come alongside them in doing some church planting and development there. And while I was visiting with the pastor, he was asking me about my past, and so I told him all that I'd done. I talked to him a little about Ben, and he said, well, I got a ministry I want to show you. And it was a ministry to the brothels there in Athens. And I had seen Taken, I had read about the issue of human trafficking, but I'd never met it face to face. And it was the most horrific thing I think I've ever seen. When I was talking to Lisa the other day, I said at first I only was on the prayer team and we would go out and pray, but I felt like we were standing outside a Starbucks coffee shop because the men were just going in and out of the different rooms looking for the woman they wanted. It was unbelievable. And I remember one street I stood on, and it was just like a residential area, like you would go down this street over here and the houses. And you always knew it was a brothel because they had a white light out. And there was a 6-year-old boy sitting in his big picture window just watching all the men go in and out of the house. Now, he probably didn't know what was going on, but eventually he would. He would get it all figured out. So it was, and it's legal there in Greece. It has been legal there since biblical times. And so the politicians and the police force don't see anything wrong with it, that it's just a normal thing. But eventually they let me go inside of a brothel and start working with the women. And that was even more gut-wrenching, to walk in and you see a line of men sitting up over here waiting. She's taking a break, but they're waiting over here. And the madam she has a madam and she handles everything. And she gets like a 10-minute break and then she's gone and then she comes back. It was like this bizarre, now I lived a hard life and I did some rough things, but that was the most eye-opening to me to see how deep our depravity can be and how deep our sin can be. These girls probably were like 15, 16, 17 years old. Most of them Eastern European, no Greek women were in the brothels. They were all brought in. And listening to their stories and how they got there and how they had been wooed into the country just broke my heart. God did what I had been begging for, that I wanted to go to the mission field. And I'd always begged. There's a passage that I always clung to. This was my life verse when I was kicking and screaming to God about going to the mission field. And it's in Deuteronomy, it's 3, starts with verse 23. And I pleaded with the Lord God at that time, saying, O Lord, you have only begun to show your servant your greatness and your mighty hand. For what God is there in heaven and on earth who can do such works and mighty acts as yours? And I had seen God. I saw God heal Ben. I mean, I believe in healing because I saw it. Ben was written off. And those of you who know Ben know he is phenomenal. I don't know what else to say. He is amazing. He has the faith of a child. He believes earnestly that what God says is coming to pass. My favorite thing with Ben is one of the girls were worried about something that was going to happen in a few weeks or something. He looked at her and he said, I just don't worry about that. He said, because God gave me today. He may not give me next week. So I'm just going to focus on what I need to do for today. And that's the way we should live, which is true. It was just that simple faith that he has. But anyway, I had seen him do mighty works, and I knew I could be a missionary, and Ben could too. But finally the Lord was angry and said, because you would not listen to me, and the Lord said to me, enough from you. Do not speak to me of this matter again. Go up to the top of Pisgah and lift up your eyes westward and northward and southward and eastward, and look at it with your eyes, for you shall not go over this Jordan. But charge Joshua and encourage and strengthen him, for he shall go over at the head of this people, and he shall put them in possession of the land that you shall see. And that became my life verse when I was with MTW. I was not going to live overseas. And God brought me to my knees on that one. But what I did at MTW was to take college students and church groups and give them a vision of what God was doing in a country or with a group of people, and then come back and help prepare them to go and do what God was calling them to do. So when I was able to begin to minister on a long-term basis with these women, it was almost like God had brought me complete circle again. And now I'm doing what I always felt like I was called to do, which is to minister one-on-one. And so I hope through all of this that you all have saw the body of Christ at work in my life, and the body of Christ continues to be at work in my life. I couldn't have come where I wouldn't be here today. God brought me here, I know that. But he used so many different believers in my life, in different phases of my life, to bring me to a real faith in him. Now my faith falters still, but now I have this sweet little Ben that reminds me God is faithful. You know, God has brought us through so much together. And one other, I want to close with another way the body has worked in my life is I went through a great deal of suffering with Ben, and we had a lot of life change. My dad, about 6 years after Ben's injury, was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and he wasn't a believer. And I had tried to share the gospel with him, and he wouldn't listen to me. But one night I was over there, and we were talking, and I had given him a calendar that had that passage in Psalm that's, wash me and I shall be white as snow, cleanse me and I shall be, I can't remember the exact way it goes. And he looked at me, he said, you really believe that, don't you? And I said, yeah, I do. And I said, I wish one day you would too. So I think it was either the next day or the day after, Doc McGinnis went to visit my dad. And he probably just received Christ with Doc. Tom had a big impact on bringing Ben to the Lord and even bringing us into church. Betty Graves, I think some of you may even know her, had a huge impact. She took me back and forth to see Ben because I didn't drive, so she would go and sit with me in rehab with Ben and minister to me and care for me. They all made sure that Ben always celebrated his birthday. They would, and when Tom passed away, Dot and Betty kept it going, and then Coulter, Lisa's brother, picked up where Tom had left off and began taking care of Ben. So the McGinnis family and the Krieger family have been in my life and probably have had a huge impact on my walk with God. Not probably, they have. It's been a huge impact and helping me learn to love Ben as a new man. And I will have to say I love Ben more today, I think, than I did when we married. It's we've got this unique little bond that we have learned together to read each other. A cute little story about Ben. I have a lot of cute Ben stories, but one of them I was telling Lisa the other day is when Ben came home from his behavioral program, we had to set up an hour-by-hour check-in. I had to do an hour-by-hour check-in on Ben to let him know how his behavior was. And, I had to say, wow, we did this and you did really well. You controlled yourself. And so if that happened, then I played cards with him. But if it had a bad hour, then I didn't play cards with him. And so I had to give him constant feedback, hour by hour. And that went on for about 4 years. It was like every day, hour by hour, he had to be reinforced with his behavior until he learned to identify when he was about to lose it, and or when he said something he shouldn't. And it was amazing when he did it, you saw that light bulb go off, and it was almost like, I can control myself now, and you don't have to control me anymore. So, but then now, when we go out to eat, or when we go do things, we get in the car, and he reaches over, your behavior was so good tonight. I had so much fun. You were in such a good mood. So now he's modifying my behavior and helping me along. So, but thank y'all for bearing with me. I hope I didn't ramble too awfully much, but I do hope that you saw God and not me through this walk.